be talking about unpacking the Kenya Housing Survey basic reports for 2023-24. And this is just the outline. I think Winnie has talked on why this webinar, the survey methodology that was used by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics to find data on different variables that will inform our debate today. Then the highlights of demand and supply data. We'll be looking at the demand side. The demand side is majorly the population, and the supply side is majorly the private sector and the government that's now doing affordable housing units for the population that demands it. And the final bit will just be understanding what the housing policy should be. Then we'll be making some conclusions on the same. So I'll be taking you through the first bit on the survey methodology and highlights of demand and supply side. Then Kwame will be doing what the housing policy should be, and finally the conclusions. So just to brush through, I think Winnie has already discussed on why this webinar, so I'll just be highlighting a bit of it. So to raise literacy around housing conditions. So according to the data provided by in these reports on the Kenya Housing Survey for 2023-24, they've done a bit of demographic and economic characteristics, different forms of tenancy and home ownership, as well as they've also discussed different amenities around the housing issue. And also we'll also be looking at reviewing the point estimates. So why they're point estimates? Because this was a survey on housing contained from the Kenya Housing Survey. So finally, we'll be framing Kenya's housing policy problem, trying to understand what really is the problem. Is it a shortage of housing units, or it's a different problem in the housing sector? So our main source for the day for this webinar, most of the data has been compiled from the Kenya Housing Survey Basic Report for 2023-24. And the primary objective, I think Winnie has already mentioned this, was to provide up-to-date statistics on housing in Kenya to inform policy analysis, because I think the last data was done in the census report. So it's just an update of statistics on housing in Kenya. So on to our methodology, the coverage was it was a total of 48 components. It was at the national level first, and then the 47 counties each individually was included in the survey. Then as of 2024, Kenya had a total population of 51,525,585. So the sample size for the survey that was conducted was 25,900 households. And for these 25,900 households, they were placed in 1,295 clusters. So just to provide a bit on the highlights of the data, what the data contains, all the way from demographics to the amenities. So these are the highlights of the data. First of all, you'll be looking at the Kenya population pyramid. So from the 51 million people in Kenya, it's been highlighted in terms of male and female. And we can see from ages 0 to 4 all the way to 14, that's 10 to 14, there's a huge bulge, as well as a peculiar bulge towards 65 plus. So in the survey, they described there's a dependency ratio. So the dependency ratio is basically the average number of economic dependent people per 100 economically productive people. So it's the ages between the ages below 15 So the labor force has been computed as 15 to 64. So below 15 and those who are above 65, those are people who fall in the category of the dependency ratio. So from the bars that you can see here, 14 and below, and also 65 and above, we can see there's a high dependency ratio, and we'll get to see that in the data in our future slides. So from this, from the ages of 0 to 4 all the way to 30 to 34, the population, it's a huge bulge in population, the youth population and also the child population. This simply shows the demand side for housing in future from this population. And also the dependency ratio in terms of, yes, those who are under 15 and those who are over 65 years. And then we'll be looking at different household characteristics. So Kenya has a total of 13,886,126 households. And of this, 61.4% are in the rural areas. That is almost 8.5 million households are in the rural areas, and we will get to see why. And also in the urban areas is 38.6% of this, 13,886,126 households. That's around 5 million households are in the urban areas. So from this, the total urban population from the 51 million is 16,374,954. That's close to 31.78% from the 51 million situated in urban areas. And in the rural areas, it's 35,150,632. That's 68.22% of the total 51 million. And we'll get to see how this affects the household size and also the space and also the income in a household. And for the people with disability share, out of the 51 million Kenyans, a total of 942,076 are disabled. And for the male is 396,872 with 545,204 being female. So disability is somehow a female problem, the disability share. And then we'll be looking at table 1, which explains the dependency ratios by type and residence. If you remember the slide on the population pyramid, so the dependency ratio, if we define it again, it's just the average number of economic dependent people per 100 economically productive people. So per 100 economically productive people, the total number of economic dependent people that are involved, that are included there. So yeah, according to these dependency ratio numbers, okay, we'll not go through the whole of it, but we'll just highlight the salient issues. So if we look at the national level, the total dependency ratio is 65.5, with more of it leaning towards child dependency at 59, and the old age dependency at 6.5. Then the rural dependency ratio has surpassed the national average, and it at 72.8 compared to its urban counterparts at 51.6. And from this, you can see that according to these dependency ratios, most of the children, that those are below 15, and the older people, yeah, those are the people who are above 64, are situated in rural areas, and the dependency ratio in rural areas, the dependency ratio for children also is high in rural areas, the child dependency, both in rural and urban areas. So yes, so this is just to say per 100 economically productive people, 66 dependents being children, and six or seven people being old people. are situated in Kenya, and this that shows how many people are dependent maybe on a household head or maybe a single income for shelter and for food and among other things. Yeah. Then next is just the tenureship status and residence. So for the tenureship status, it shows four forms of tenureship status. We have ownership, paying rent or leasing, no rent with consent of owner, no rent or squatting. So, and from this data, if we look at the totals on who owns, who pays rent, who's renting with, who's not paying rent with consent of owner, and who's squatting, you can see the dominant form of tenureship in Kenya. It's ownership, and in rural areas, it's the highest in rural areas. Then, if we look at renting, the dominant form of ownership for both for the urban, it's 72.3. So this data just shows the dominant form of tenureship status for rural and urban areas. For the rural areas, is ownership, and for urban areas, is paying rent. And for rural areas, we'll get to see in future slides why the dominant form of ownership, the dominant form of tenureship status is ownership in rural areas. And from this, we can also see that at least from the ownership and paying rent for the whole country, at least 94.7% of tenureship status is through exchange of value. There's money exchange through payment of rent, either by owning, either purchasing, constructing. There's money exchange, and also payment of rent, either through, yes, or leasing. So this economic exchange involved. And next, we'll be looking at the distribution of household size by residence and region. So for this, it's across three different residents. So it's Kenya, then rural areas and urban areas. And the household size is categorized in terms of 1 to 2 people, 3 to 4 persons, 5 to 6 persons, 7 to 8 persons, 9 to 10 persons, and households that have more than 11 people. And yeah, we can see if we look at Kenya, the residents Kenya, the mode appears as 1 to 2 people. Yes, it's at 67% is between 1 to 2 people, then 1 to 4 people. Yes, it's at 67%, the 34.1 plus 33.5. At least 1 to 4 people appear is the most dominant for the Kenyan level, for the whole country nationally. Household sizes are contained of 1 to 4 people. Then for the rural situation, it tends to have like an even distribution for the 1 to 2 people, 3 to 4 people, and 5 to 6 people. The disparity is not so huge. And then for the urban households, we can see the dominant one is 1 to 2 people, and it has even surpassed the national average at 34.1%. So from this, we can conclude that the most dominant household sizes in Kenya is 1 to 2 people, and we'll see how that's important in our future slides. Yes, so for this table 4, it just explains the household size by tenureship. So from the 4 different tenureship statuses, that is owning, paying rent or leasing, no rent with consent of owner, then there's no rent or squatting. Yeah, it's still a tenureship status. So from this, these numbers do add vertically. So for the owning, 24.4 people, 24.4%, that is 1 to 2 persons, they own. Then 3 to 4 people, that is 32.5%, they own houses. So for ownership, the most dominant household size is 3 to 4 people. Then for paying rent or leasing, if you look at this column, paying rent or leasing, it's easier for 1 to 2 people to pay rent or lease houses. Then that is 48.3%. Then no rent with consent of owner. The most dominant one is 1 to 2 persons, and it's at 58.8%. Then for no rent or squatting, that is 41.5%. That is an average of 1 to 2 people. And the ownership and renting, leasing are they express the forms of economic exchange. And at least 94.6% of households in the 2023-24 Kenya Housing Survey either paying rent or owning houses. And this shows a market exists, this exchange of values between the demand and the supply side of the housing market. Then the tenureship by level of education. This chart simply shows the different forms of tenureship, different modes of tenureship status across all levels of education, and all levels of education are covered in tenureship. So all levels of education are included in owning houses, in paying rent or leasing, in no rent with consent of owner, and also in squatting. So for tenureship for in terms of owning, the education level that's is involved in that's dominant in terms of ownership, that is the primary level of education. And this does not mean most people with primary level of education are the ones who own most of the houses, because this is just a survey. They did it according to a different certain sample number, so it does not generalize ownership as majorly a primary education thing. Or and for payment of rent or leasing, the secondary level of education are the most dominant, and this shows the income aspect in this, because at secondary education they are able maybe to get jobs and earn an income that will be able to help them in the economic exchange by paying rent. And like we've seen, most of the people who pay rent are situated in urban areas, because most of the household ownership is in the rural areas. Then for no rent with consent of owner, we have the primary education level as the most dominant, followed by the secondary level of education. Then for no rent or squatting, we have the primary level also being dominant in this, followed by the no education level. So one peculiar thing that we try to note in this is the university level of education across the 4 different tenures: the owning, the paying rent, the no rent with consent of owner, and also the squatting. So for the university level, the most dominant form of tenureship is paying rent or leasing. This just shows a form of economic activity that they might be doing that enables them to pay rent and to earn an income and pay rent. So, and also they're also involved in squatting because of the unemployment factor that plays in, whereby they're not able to pay rent and they become squatters. And this data for the education level, tenureship by education level, just shows that the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics recognizes employment and income as a key thing in the housing market demand. So for demand and supply to occur, there has to be a form of a mode of earning income, and also the income itself And yeah, other factors also play in the housing market demand. Then status of household health by residents. Yes, this chart just connects labor market statistics to tenureship. It just shows most household heads from rural, the national level, that the total. Then you have the rural and the urban. Most of them are employed. So the employment factor and the income factor are still key in the household market demand. Yeah, that plays a huge role. Then you have a rating of household unit safety by households with people with disabilities. So different people with disabilities, from the 996,000 people with disabilities living in different households, they were interviewed, and yeah, these were the findings. So a total of 377,275 households were interviewed from the total population, and the total number of households living with people with disabilities, and the dominant disability categories were mobility, which stands at 165,750 households, and visual, that is 115,216. So this is essential in maybe the housing supply to consider housing unit safety for the people with disabilities. And next is just the distribution of dwelling structures by type of residence. So this cuts across different dwelling structures, all the way from bungalows to townhouse. So the most dominant one is bungalows for the rural areas. Yeah, the rural areas have like the most number of bungalows, followed by the national level. Yeah, it's actually above the national average, which is at 51.8%. And the rural one is at 71.8%. And the bungalows just signify land ownership, because it's an on-compound house most of the time, and it's self-contained. So in rural areas, it's much easier to uh, go about construction of a bungalow. Then for urban areas, yeah, there's the preference for apartments. Yes, and it's seen here as 28.8, which is the preference for apartments and Swahili or compound houses sharing facilities. So most people prefer these two because of maybe they have a house in the rural area, or land costs, and also income. So income plays a huge factor in this, affordability, and also land. Yeah, this is just a computation from the other chart, which explains the distribution of households by dwelling structure. And from this, you can see and from the national numbers, you can see the bungalows are like the most dominant form of ownership. Sorry, bungalows are the most dominant dwelling structure, and majorly they're situated in the rural areas. It has like the higher proportion, that is 71.8%. That's why it makes the national level, the national dwelling structure average to be at 51.8%. And in urban areas, it's at 20%. At 20%, that's the bungalows. Then for the flat or apartments, at the national level, it's at 11.5%, and Swahili or compound houses sharing facilities, it's at 21.2. So from this, we can see for the urban areas, the housing facilities that are more dominant are the compound houses sharing facilities and apartments. This is due to the population density in urban areas that affect demand and supply of these houses, and also the small pieces of land in urban areas that necessary for construction of more houses that go up instead of construction of bungalows. And yeah, for the rural areas, for them to construct bungalows, it's just the availability of land as well as readily available materials that necessitates ease in construction of these bungalows. Next is just rent to household expenditure. And yeah, at the national level, at least if we look at the total, at least 36.9% of household expenditure is spent on rent, which is the second thing coming after expenditure on food. And this is explained in the Kenya Integrated Budget and Household Survey. So they tend to pay at disproportionately higher share of their income. Different households, they tend to pay a disproportionately higher share of their income on housing, and it comes second after food. So from this, urban households tend to pay 38% of their expenditure. They allocate 38% of their expenditure on housing, that's on rent, while their rural counterparts allocate 29.6% of their household expenditure towards rent. And urban households tend to allocate higher a higher share of 38% of their household expenditure towards rent because of the cost of living in most urban areas, as well as the quality of housing in urban areas that necessitates more payment allocation of more of their household expenditure towards rent. And from this, you can see that there are some outlier counties that have different rent to household expenditure, because most of the counties have lower rent in the rural areas and more rent in the urban areas, but there are some counties which have sort of the reverse. And we can see an example of Marsabit that pays 50.3% of their household expenditure, and 41 to in rural areas, and 41.4% in urban areas. And you also have counties like Siaya, which pays 40.5% of their household expenditure towards allocates 40.5% of their household expenditure towards rent, and that is in rural areas, and 33.8% of their expenditure towards rent in urban areas. So this might be explained by the fact that houses might be few. So it explains the aspect of scarcity, and also maybe incomes might be lower, and these are also upcoming urban areas. So the rents tend to be on the higher side in rural areas. Then chart 5, it just shows the rent collection entities, and it shows majority of individuals pay rent directly to their landlord, followed by, that is 76.5%, followed by those who pay through an agent, that is 19.3%. This is close to 95%. 95% of people pay either directly through an agent, or they pay it directly through their landlord. So we can see that there's a smaller share of people who pay through the national government, the county government, and the parastatals. So the larger share, almost 95%, that pays 95 or 96%, that pays directly to individuals or through an agent. It just symbolizes a private exchange that is involved in the payment of rent. And this shows choice or preference issue. Then chart 6 will be looking at tenants who reported rent increments for the last 5 years, that is between 2019 to 2023. And the total, that is at the national level, at least 87.4% of tenants reported to not have their rent increased, and only 12.6% reported to have their rent increased. So from this, yes, the orange bits, we can see that the parastatals are the ones who reported, people living in houses owned by parastatals are the ones who reported to have their rents increased highly, and also private company through agents, and also, yes, county governments. Those are like the top three. Despite inflation in housing, we can only see that 12.6% tenants of the total tenant population are the ones that reported to have their rent increased in the 5 years. And also, this just shows this increased supply of housing for different income levels, and also this competition in the housing market. So through this, the supply side has to respond to the market by working with different prices for different income levels. Next, we'll just be showing the factors influencing tenants' choice of neighborhood versus the dwelling units tenants prefer to build or buy. So this is the reality against what you wish or aspire to have. So for the reality, that is the blue side, that's on the left side of your screen. Tenants prefer choice of neighborhood first through affordable rent, and also proximity to work and proximity to basic amenities. So that's the larger share, and this just shows the income aspect and also the employment. So people factor in affordability, that's the income, and yeah, the employment based, the proximity to work. Then 95% of people aspire to have modern form of housing. That's on the right side. That's the bungalows, the maisonettes, and the flats or apartments. Yeah, so people prefer to have an on-compound house and the likes. Yeah. Then for this, it's just showing the dwelling units tenants prefer to rent and the number of bedrooms tenants prefer to rent. So the most preferable dwelling units for tenants for renting, it's a flat or apartment, and the most preferable, or rather dominant number of bedrooms tenants prefer to rent is 33.9. Oh, sorry, it's a two-bedroom house, which is at 33.9%. Then next we'll be showing plans made by tenants towards homeownership. And a total of 62.6% of people have no plans towards homeownership. Then those who are saving to construct is 11.2, and those who are saving to buy land or plot is 10.7. And those who've already purchased a land or plot. So from this, we can see that a larger share, if we leave aside those who don't have a plan towards homeownership yet, a larger share, those who are saving to construct, and those who are saving to buy land or plot, a larger share are leaning towards homeownership, and this shows that homeownership is going to grow. And those who've already purchased land or plots, so they prefer to build their own houses rather. So, and for those who have no plan to own, might just signify that ownership is going to grow if they decide to have a house. And also, we don't want to make an assumption that everyone wants to own a house. And also, of course, these people, maybe they're leaned on the aspect that preferences change with time. So they might want different houses at different times of their lives. Next is just the modes of home acquisition, and it shows that close to 99% of home acquisitions mode are through economic exchange. That is purchase, constructed one-off, constructed incremental, inherited, or gifts. This is through they're adding to economic exchange by adding value. And 82%, that is purchase, constructed, and it's through exchange of money to get housing as the good. Then for the which is 8.7%. So we can see from this, most homeowners prefer to acquire their home through cooperative or SACCOs and commercial banks, and by the government intervening into the housing market by trying to offer mortgage financing, that is the housing finance institution. Maybe they're not responding to the market needs. And for factors influencing the choice of area of homeowners, the land issue plays a huge role here, because most people prefer to build on inherited land, and this comes out from a reduced cost or reduced land costs, because you just have to do the construction maybe from readily available materials and acquire labor, and also affordable land. So land costs also translates to income. Yeah, they play a huge role in the choice of area for homeowners. Next is dwelling units by durability of the main type of material. So these are just the amenities. For this, we'll just be showing the dwelling units by durability. Yes, different. Yeah, we have floor, we have walls, and we also have roofing. So for the main type of floor material, we're looking at powder all the way to cement and tiles. So for the rural areas, the most dominant type of floor material, it was non-durable. That might be earth, cow dung, yeah. And in urban areas, the most dominant floor material was durable materials. And for the whole country, it was durable material. And you can see the durable floor material in rural areas was below the national average. That is 41.8%, which is below the national average, 58.9%. So this points out to the structure fitness, and also the the fit for habitation household in rural areas. Then we have dwelling units by main type of wall material and residence. So for dwelling units by main type of wall material and residence, we can see that the national average, that is Kenya, for the durable, it's 47.2, and non-durable, it's 52.6. So the most dominant type of wall material for at the national level, it's the non-durable material. And also we found in the data that 0.1% of households do not have walls. That translates to around 13,000 houses do not have walls. And in urban areas, of course, the type of wall material is more durable. That is the durable type 77.6 against the non-durable of 23.4%. And in rural areas, of course, the non-durable is the most dominant one at 67.7%. So rural areas have more housing units, but the durability we've seen in terms of floor material and wall material, the durability is, most of it is non-durable. Then we have the type of roof material. For the type of roof material, all across, there seems to be there's not a huge disparity all across the three different residences, the rural, urban, and the national level. For the rural, it's at 90.8%. Urban, it's 98.8%, and for Kenya, it's 93.6%. So this just shows materials in roofing. It might provide diverse choices that enable people to, according to their income levels, to be able to afford different roofing materials that are durable. And yeah, for the rural areas, it's of course below the national average. Then the distribution of households by average area per person and household size. So for this, it just shows different household sizes, all the way from households that contain 1 to 2 persons to 11 to more than 11 people. So the average is 19.4. That is the average area per person nationally. And yeah, it was across 13,886,000 houses. 13,886,000 households, 126. And this data shows the lesser the more the people, the lesser the average area per person, the average area per person that a person occupies, and it will just be shown in the feed for habitation data in a future slide. Then the number of persons per habitable room. This just shows households that were fit for habitation and those that weren't fit for habitation. And at the national level, at least 68.1% of households were fit for habitation, while 31.9% of households were unfit for habitation. And the fit and unfit for habitation, it's explained in the report where a household is considered fit or unfit in the population. So, sorry, for habitation. So, if you get to go read the report, you'll get to understand why a household is categorized as fit or unfit for habitation. Maybe it's the electricity, the water, the sanitation, eh, the wall structure, the roofing, the floor, among other things. And yeah, also in the rural areas, 65.7% of households were fit for habitation and 34.31 fit for habitation. And of course, the urban households that were fit for habitation surpassed the national average, and while the rural residences that were unfit for habitation were below the national average. Then we'll talk about distribution of persons per habitable room by residence and county. So this just shows houses that were considered fit for habitation by not being crowded. So houses that were crowded, maybe the average square size per person was less. Yeah, we've seen in the data for 1 to 2 persons all the way to 11, more than 11 people. So by crowding
I'm
being
sorry,
involved.
Mo, could
Yes.
you please try and wrap up in 2 to 3 minutes?
Yeah, I'm on the last slide.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So on the distribution of persons per habitable room by residence and county, so at least 68.1% of households of houses were considered fit for habitation, and 31.9%, that's close to a third of households, were considered unfit for habitation. And then it sort of flips. In the rural areas, most of the houses were considered unfit for habitation. That is 65.7 against 65.7 were considered fit for habitation against 34.3%, which were considered unfit for habitation. If we compare the houses that were considered unfit for habitation, the rural households surpass the national average, and there's a huge disparity between the urban and the rural. Yes. And lastly, is the structure fitness by residents and counties. So for structure fitness, they were considered fit for occupation in terms of materials used for construction. So most of the houses, or rather the residences in the country, were considered unfit for occupation. That is 55.9%. And this is seen majorly in the rural areas, which is at 72.1%, compared to the urban areas, which has structures of fit at 75.6%. Yeah, thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
So thank you so much, Mo, for unpacking that data and just helping us understand the implication of the data for the demand and the supply side, and also just taking us through housing preferences, home ownership, distribution of households, and all this other information that you've given us, and relating it back to incomes and also household expenditures and how that affects affordability and access to proper housing. So having taken us through the data and shown us what the data actually tells us as far as the housing sector in Kenya is concerned, we now want to understand what the housing policy should actually look like, and also what key priority areas should we be focusing on as a country as we have this housing policy conversation. So Kame is coming in to take us through the second part of the presentation, which will help us frame the housing policy problem. So Kwame?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll make this quick because we already spent so much time. So what we have had is that this is almost a 200-page report with a lot of the Kenya Housing Survey for 2022-23-24 is almost a 200-page report with a lot of data, certainly as some of the highlights that we presented. In addition to that, it has a lot of appendices. So it's something I'd recommend to everybody, and you don't have to read it all at a go. If you can take chapters of it and just read it, it'll be quite educating. But as we say, the purpose of the National Bureau of Statistics itself says that one of the reasons this report is published is so that it can advance policy discussion or policy conversations. So the first part is basically the presentation of the data and trying to mix those data sets to tell us what does it tell us about the conditions in which Kenyans live. And there are many things. Among the things we have to know, the population is 51 million, and those 51 million people live in 13.5 million units, coming down to about 3.7 people per household. But of course, it varies by urban, rural, but also certain counties have smaller and higher sizes. So that's the data that we have. Now, our function here, and people have sent me questions, is not necessarily to assess the effectiveness of the affordable housing scheme, though it's some of the data that's presented here points to the problems that are being solved or what it's supposed to respond to. My intention in the next couple of minutes is to ask ourselves, if this is the way Kenyans live, if these are 13 million households recognized, spread across the republic in different formations, there are ownership structures that exist, there are ways in which people fund. What does it tell us are the standout issues regarding housing policy or what housing problem is? So that's what we're going to try and discuss based entirely on that data. Now, in our next slide, in slide 35, yes. If you think about all the data that Mo has given you, and I hope it's bigger in your screen than it is in mine, because it looks really, really small here. But basically what we've done here is to try and ask ourselves the question. We are asking ourselves the question, what does that data tell us? How do you consolidate that data to tell a picture? And what we've tried to present here is to use a radar map. You all know radar maps. And a radar map just trying to tell you, okay, what are the various summarizing data points, and what do they tell about the state of play. So this is the state of play in Kenya. And it will tell you the advantages, it will tell you the housing problems, and it will tell you the achievements around housing in summarized data points. So one of the things that you realize is a house is basically a structure that provides shelter. And the ways to analyze what quality of housing or what housing does is to ask ourselves, okay, what is it comprised of? And in very basic forms, it's comprised of three things. One, there's a roof, there's a floor, and there's a wall. Now, this chart, which we have drawn ourselves of the data in the report, tells you something. And it's a bit dark in the background because we needed to create the contrast. But what it's telling you is we are trying to measure the conditions for living or shelter in Kenya, regardless of what it is. It must have a roof, it must have a wall, it must have a floor of some kind. Though Maureen, as Maureen said, in the data, it showed that actually 13,000 Kenyans live in houses that have no walls. Now, let's imagine what that means. But for the time being, let's get here and ask ourselves. Now, what this does is that the orange pentagon is basically a structure, is drawn around the data regarding the durability of the roof, the durability of the wall, and durability of the floor. And then the other is basically structural fitness, which is when you put together the entire structure, is it fit for human habitation? And then the other one is basically to talk about what share of the rooms within that structure are habitable. So of course you can have a house, but the different separations within the house have different levels of habitability, partly because, of course, there might be deterioration one way or the other. Now, why does the National Bureau of Statistics, or rather global housing policy, tends to consider durability is important? Because non-durable forms have performed less pleasantly in actually covering for the roof. If you're non-durable roof, basically what it means is you're going to have to separate it, to replace it more often. But let's go to the data. Now, the orange part is basically the urban area. So what it's telling you is that in terms of durability of floors, in terms of durability of wall, in terms of durability of roof, and habitability and structure, urban housing as measured by the 2023-24 survey are actually better because it's on the outer side. So the more, the closer it is to the perfect hexagon, the better it is for that value. So if you look at it here, it's telling you something about durable. Roofs in Kenya are almost at a near point where basically all of them are durable. And you know why? Roofs in Kenya have, and again, durability is measured in durable material which will last for the medium term, because a house tends to be an investment that lasts for long. So obviously nobody changes their roof every week. And therefore, the more durable material, the better that house would be. The walls, you start to see that the walls obviously has, for urban and rural areas, they are both in the center. The national average is actually somewhere between national and urban. For everything else, between rural and urban, because the urban numbers drive the averages towards the outside. But what it's telling you is this: as Kenyans, we live in houses with good durable roofs. Middle level, half of us live with durable walls. And durable floors are about 90%. On the structural fitness side, the blue line, let's concentrate on the blue, on the green one. So the green one, it's telling you that a good number of Kenyans live with durable floors. About half of us live with good durable walls, and then about slightly more than 60%. So what does that tell you? It's a question of the affordability of the structure. So it looks as if roofs are more affordable, and the National Bureau of Statistics doesn't mention that, but we put in the economic spin, which tells you roofing material in Kenya is available for all strata of incomes, and there's a diverse set of choices that are durable. So it's an affordability question, whether it's corrugated sheets, whether it's tiles of different kinds imported and those made domestically. Some of it is even asbestos. Of course, we know the trouble with asbestos, but on the whole, roofs in Kenya tend to be more durable. The moment you start to use more industrial or products that are more complex and more expensive, which require firm and sturdy walls on the one side and floors that are not earth-made or done, then you start to see those distortions where the rural households have a problem. And of course, urban households, the national in between. So rural households in Kenya in general, while they're the majority, have poor walls, they have poor durability of structural fitness, of floors, and of course, poor durability of the roof, of the floor and roof as well. Floor and walls as well. And on the structural fitness side, again, I think that tends to be a problem nationally as well, even though, as you can tell, for urban areas, it's closer to 80% of the houses are actually structurally fit, basically structurally fit for that purpose. But on the habitability of rooms, that's where Kenya's challenge is on the structural fitness and the habitability. Now, what this tells you is the living conditions in Kenya are far from perfect. Something needs to happen about changing the durability of the walls and to improve the durability of floors. But more importantly, habitable rooms and structural fitness is required. So what it's telling you is that in some houses in this country, the rooms in general are of different quality, suggesting that because of constraints in finance and affordability, people emphasize perhaps doing the main sitting areas, some bedrooms, and obviously some certain areas have less. And that's not difficult to understand because if you look at it, Kenyans tend to build houses, as you say, for ownership over a period of time and not once. So obviously it's a development of a medium term, perhaps even a longer term. So if this is the housing question in problem with the situation, I think it will tell you that the policy focus needs to respond to what's happening here. Try to build structures and try to create habitability, and at the same time, raise the quality of the walls. That seems to me to be a problem. And as you can tell, what is required for walls? Obviously, steel, the cost of cement, the cost of building materials in general. And those building materials in Kenya are some of the most expensive for countries at Kenya's income level, if not the world as well. So that's the problem. So if we summarize anything else, I think this picture helps us to summarize what the situation is, because a house is not just one thing. It is a structural factor. It's a structure that puts together many different things. So that's one. What's the housing problem in Kenya? I think it suggested we have a problem with habitability, with the structural integrity, and most importantly, with the concrete wall. With the durability of the wall. In our next slide, we try to ask ourselves, there's a big question in Kenya about whether there's a shortage of housing or not. And you ask yourselves, if you look at urban rural populations, 31% of the population is based in urban areas. 68% of the population is based in rural areas, so we are still a largely rural population. Households, while 31% of the population are based in urban areas, 38% of all the houses are in house. Of the households, basically, the structures are in urban areas, suggesting to you almost immediately that urban areas will have more people. Fewer people per house because there are more houses for a smaller number of people. Based on those structures as well. So you can see on the other side, 68% of the population live in 61% of the houses, suggesting that yes, something about urban density informs that there are many more houses in urban areas per person than there is. And you can see that from houses per capita. In urban areas, three average household size is 3, average household size in rural areas is 4. So there's that range between 3 and 4. Please remember this average household size in urban areas and rural areas, because that will be material for the conversation that will go into to try and answer the question, is there a housing shortage in Kenya? Again, basing it on this data that exists. So let's go now to the next slide, 37. So it leads us to the question, what should the housing policy be? And he asks 4 questions specifically here. These are our questions. This is not based on, this is the policy discussion part of the discussion. So does Kenya have a housing shortage? We'll try to answer. Is urban housing expansion the imperative? Is the absence of mortgages a reflection of market failure? Because we've had these claims made here. And what is the affordable housing levy responding to, therefore? Those 4 questions are the ones, they're not the only questions we could ask from the data that we've received, but we think those are 4 policy questions that would help us. And for those of you who are here, to actually have a better appreciation of what is it, the reality, and what is the aspiration that Kenya's policy should pursue. So let's go to those questions one after the other. So in the next slide, in slide 38, yes, Now, to answer the question about housing shortage, one of the things that I did was to ask ourselves, okay, let's try and see. Two things matter as we've been shown. A house is a structure that requires basic construction. So you have to rearrange blocks, you have to get a piece of land and do it. So it's basically an economic activity. And as you can see, as Maureen told us, that there are two major forms of structural things. 80% of the houses in Kenya come from either renting. 75% of the houses in Kenya come from either renting or from purchase, all of which are basically ownership, all of which represent economic activity. So that reminds me as a student of economics that there's a housing market and it's fairly robust. If 80% of households represent that kind of economic activity, it's fairly robust. But housing shortage and housing demand are driven by two things: population size, that's one; incomes, two; and population structure. Those three things. If you put those three things together, it will tell you in Kenya, we already have 13.5, almost 13.6 million households housing 51 million people. So the number of people per house is about 3.7. If you take the average, of course, it varies. It's 3 in urban areas and it's 4.7 in rural areas. Those are averages. So we ask yourself, we plot on one side of this domain, what is the average housing size per country? For these countries, we've chosen a few countries, and what's the income per capita? Because that house, as a private good, is going to be purchased from the income that people have. And again, the demand is determined by the average family size or the average household size. So what you can see here are 5 countries that we've plotted. We've plotted 5 countries. We've left Kenya out for illustration, but we plotted the United States. The average housing size in the United States for an income of $81,000 per person per year is 2.5. In Germany, at $56,000 per person per year, $57,000 per person per year, it's about 2.0, slightly more than 2.0, about 2.01. Brazil has 3.3, and at an income level of about $9,000. India and Uganda, India and Nigeria, which are closer to Kenya, are at 5% at $2,000 each, or about $2,000 each. For Nigeria, India, about 2,400. Kenya has income level comparable to India, but the average household size in Kenya is closer to Brazil at 3.7. Now, what does that tell you? That given the number of housing stock in Kenya relative to the population that exists, Kenyans actually are showing a very high housing demand structure. So we already have, relative to the income level, much higher houses per unit, and we're counting all of them as houses, housing units, than you would guess from the income that Kenyans have. That leads me to question the big assumption of the affordable housing and housing policy in Kenya, and reports that I see telling us that Kenya has a housing shortage. Maybe not. What it might be is the quality of housing and a certain kind of housing. But if you compare according to global figures, which tends to show that when incomes rise, there's a demand because housing units because families get smaller. And therefore, that's why you need more houses, and also because of urban change. But if you look at Kenya and India and Nigeria and countries in Kenya's range, including countries such as Indonesia and others who are much, much higher than Kenya, remember, the countries that are represented here represent 28% of global population and 36% of global gross domestic product. So this is basically a bit suggestive. It is telling me that the claim that Kenya has a shortage of housing needs to be re-examined and re-examined thoroughly. So that's one. So on the housing shortage question, I need to ask what kind of housing? I actually seem to think that Kenya has a quality housing problem, not a housing numbers question. Those are two different policy questions, might require two different policy responses. I need to hurry now to the next slide. Guys, please flip quickly. Yes, is urban housing the imperative? If you look at this figure again, we are taking the existing housing stock and measuring it by habitability and structural fitness, right? So the policy imperative should be to improve housing habitability of rooms and the structural fitness of houses that exist in Kenya. And that you can do by, of course, improving the quality of the structure, walls and roof and durable floor. So this is your answer. But the more important thing that comes from this answer is, at the urban areas, on a comparative basis, and I prefer to live in the world on this is what exists. The housing solutions and problems that we develop should be directed at rural people, because urban people and the quality of housing that exists in urban areas is far better on every metric than those of rural areas. So again, I question all policy that is related to trying as much as possible. And I understand slums, shanties are not good places to live. But if you take the whole of Kenya as a whole, it's still clear to us from this data that structural problems, habitability problems are still overwhelmingly rural problems than urban problems. That's question 2. Let's go to that question 3. The third question was the absence of mortgages. Yeah, let's go to the next. The third question was, what happens to the absence of mortgages? One of the most impressive things about the analysis that informed Kenya's housing policy is that mortgages are a problem, or rather, mortgages are too few. And a report developed by the Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Corporation says that in 2023, sorry for the spelling mistake, there were only 30,000 mortgages in Kenya, 30,100 mortgages in Kenya, representing less than 1% of the housing stock, because the housing stock at 13 million would be 1.3, but it represents 1.86% of GDP in terms of their value. It's quite a bit of value at the time. The average mortgage size in 2023 was 9.4 million. 9.4 million per unit. And otherwise, the average mortgage in Kenya in 2023 represented that 1.8% of GDP. The average size of the house for which a mortgage was procured was 9.4 million shillings. So I asked myself, okay, people buy houses from their income and the future. 9.4 million shillings represents 33.5 years of an income per person in Kenya. 33 years. It is no wonder that mortgage numbers are that low. Why? Because incomes are low. So there's scope to expand mortgage numbers by reduction of mortgage size. But I think what it's telling us about the absence of mortgage, and we're being clever with cutting data one way or the other, is that Kenyans have an income problem. So countries that have high mortgages, and I know the US, other countries that have as much as 50% of them GDP represented in mortgages and mortgage liabilities over time and in the future, but it tends to be at higher income levels. If you're going to have mortgages of 9.4 million for a country where the average income is 280,000 per year, you're telling people to limit 33 years of their income to buy a house. And remember, the average amount of money spent in rentals was about 38%. Right? So if you cut this by a third, it means Kenyans are going to spend 100 years paying rent equivalent to buy that house represented by today's mortgage. So using mortgage absence as an indicator of failed housing or a market failure in housing in Kenya is to be dishonest with data. It's disingenuous. You're simply measuring money problems. I mean, you're simply measuring income, employment, and the absence of real employment and income. So that's basically, so yes, let's improve mortgages to 1 million if we wish to. That would be a good thing. But I'm thinking that's not going to happen unless you cut down the mortgage sizes substantially. That's one. And secondly, the preference changes because Kenyans prefer to fund their own. So what might happen is basically you just change the distribution as my colleague showed us that Kenyans fund it from SACCOs, from all others. What you might change is to redistribute money from SACCOs to mortgage companies and all the others. But I'm not persuaded that by itself, the absence of mortgages is in itself a show that there's a market failure in Kenya. Finally, in the next slide, the cost effectiveness. Now, the meeting today is not about assessing the affordable housing policy. It's simply to ask us, and that will come. We definitely will do it because it's up there. It's a lot of money being spent and being cut from everybody's wages. We're going to assess it, but that's a question for the future. Today, I asked myself, what's the cost effectiveness if this is the policy questions that we've seen? The quality of houses, the income imperative, and obviously the quality of houses, the income imperative, and obviously the population density that Kenya has, and the quality of the housing stock. So now the affordable housing claims that the cost per unit will range from 840 to 5.6 million. Now 840 is sensible because it represents 3 years of income at 280 by 3 years with about 840. Sensible. The average house in the US, for instance, And the average house in the US is usually 5 years of income. So a house in the range of 840,000 shillings would probably be sensible. And for that reason, yes, that's properly scaled. If you're talking about a house in the year 5.6 on the higher range, it's 20 years of average income. And if people pay it by a third, you're asking people to spend what they're spending today, one third of their income for 60 years to be able to acquire a range. So that again leads me to the cost effectiveness. Remember, the government intends to construct 200,000 houses per year. 200,000 houses per year at the cost of 840,000 will be 160 billion per year. I am questioning the cost effectiveness of spending 160 billion per year fixing a problem that, as we've shown, is not a housing stock problem, but a housing quality problem. And finally, so as we conclude, housing demand in Kenya is revealed by the share of income that is spent on shelter, about 38%. Of course, it varies across the country depending on what the incomes are. It's a little high in urban areas, though certain places show outliers. The preference for ownership is evident, especially in rural areas where 85% of people own their homes. In urban areas, people prefer to rent or lease for obvious reasons. Many of them have second homes. And the second one is they do not intend to acquire a permanent structure at that life cycle. Urban areas have also a variety of options for housing, but that's conditioned by the income levels. And I will say this, I'm even more persuaded before this data than before, housing problem is not a supply question. An adding supply of 200,000 for 13 million would be about 1% per year. Even if you build a new housing stock, assuming no other private sector comes in, would probably add about 4 to 5% of the stock in urban areas, might upset urban areas markets, but it will not change the housing condition represented by that web radar map that we showed you. The constraint is economic, it is about jobs, and it is about employment and income. So if you want to create more employment and more income, let's fix the structural questions of houses, not necessarily constructing new ones. It will give lots of money to other people, that's very, very true, and let's tackle the problem for where it is. Thank you very much. My apologies for taking too much time.
Thank you so much, Kwame, for taking us through the policy side of today's conversation and just trying to help us understand what really is Kenya's policy problem as far as the housing sector is concerned, and what policy areas should we be focusing on, and also just helping us also understand the implications of the lack of understanding for the exact policy problem we are responding to in the housing sector. So having said that, I hope we are in a position where we can now better interpret the Kenya Housing Survey and link it back to ongoing conversations around affordable housing and just in general, the housing policy in Kenya. At this juncture, we would want to have a Q&A and just have questions from you, our participants, if you have any questions. None has been typed in the chat box, so we will give an opportunity for us to raise our hands, and we will unmute you, or you'll unmute yourself and ask your question. And if you are shy, you could also just feel free to type in your question, and Kwame and Maureen will be very glad to respond to your question. So thank you, Kevin, for your comment. We appreciate that you appreciate that the session has been informative, and the presenters have been very articulate with the issues they have raised, and you have taken quite a bit home. So anybody with a question they'd want to ask Kwame or Maureen? Any questions for Kwame and Maureen? Yes, Kevin, please unmute yourself and ask your question. And as Kevin is unmuting himself, we have a question from Mushai. Happy New Year, Mushai. Mushai asks, where did the 200,000 units per annum demand come from? what is the effect on the housing market if we succeed? So as Kevin and Mike unmute themselves, I think Mo and Kwame, you'll also be responding to Mushai's question. So Kevin?
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. So thank you so much for the very insightful presentation. Always a pleasure to just tune in and listen. I'm just curious, as a follow-up question to Kwame's summary, if then we are talking of a question of quality of housing rather than supply, are we then looking at a problem of the cost of materials for construction? Because if there's a problem in quality housing, then that means maybe it's an issue of the proper material for construction being too expensive for the common person to be able to afford. And then what then would the policy implication look like in that kind of sector? Because then now when you're looking at materials, it's properly privatized in Kenya. It's not something that you can control. So I think that's just something that I was pondering on.
All right, so thank you, Kevin. Emmanuel, Mani, you've raised your hand twice. That must be very urgent. Please proceed.
Yes, thank you, Winnie. My name is Emmanuel Wachendo from the Institute of Economic Affairs. So I had been following this story and conversing with various colleagues. And so my question now is, in your opinion, is it to say that this housing scheme is indefensible for an economist? So if an economist was to say, look, I'm defending this on economic grounds, I sense that that argument is demolished. Is this a true assessment?
Winnie, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So thank you, Mani. We'll take a last question from Wafula. Then the presenters will respond and then we'll do another round. So Wafula, you could please unmute yourself. Wafula, unmute.
Here we go, Winnie. Yes, I've unmuted myself. First, thank you very much, both Kwame and Maureen. This is a subject close to my heart. I've written tons and tons about housing in this country and elsewhere. The point is a difference between housing demand and housing need. And that's something we need to, especially at the policy level. That's why when my colleague Michai talked about where the 200,000 come from, originally it was 200. This is just it's been like sort of catching up for a long time. So I don't want to take too much of it. I just want to compliment IEA for bringing this most important subject, because we all need housing. Whatever we need a roof over our head. But my mainstay is about maintenance, upkeep, and you said about quality. Yes, you built a house, and then houses are supposed to last 100 years. So, you know, that needs to be factored in. But I'm really so delighted. And I was dying to join this, although I was at the club and the network was not so good. But thank you very much. And I'll be talking offline with both Kwame and Maureen. But this is brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wafula. So please mute yourself, Wafula.
Sorry.
Thank you. So we will have Kwame and Mo responding to the questions and just giving us their comments on the issues that have been raised for those who've not given us questions. So I'll start with Kwame with the direct question from Kevin relating to the quality of materials and the cost of materials and its implications. So Kwame?
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for those kind comments. But yes, so let's start with Kevin. It's true. I mean, what the data has demonstrated to us, and this isn't the first time actually, because we used data before in the Kenya Population and Housing Survey, and it tells you that there's not a shortage of housing units per se. I think what needs is the quality. What we need to do is the quality of what we need to raise is the quality of housing. Those are two different questions. Now you can choose to abandon houses that exist and construct new ones, but if people don't have the income to go to those new ones, you'll have more housing units than people do, but that does not necessarily improve the living conditions of people, and that's what we were trying to. So you're right. Part of the reason why housing construction, and I thought somebody was going to ask us about why there's demolitions sometimes, or collapsing houses, which have very serious consequences. They tend to be in urban areas. And so the urban problem, as you can see, was space, but also because of that urban problem, the cost of material, construction material here, the cost of construction material here prevents people from buying steel products and concrete products, so they try to cut shortcuts, to make shortcuts. Now, that's not government's fault. I'm not saying it's government's fault, but they're responding to a demand, and yet on the other side, housing costs are too high because people have people have much lower incomes. So you're right. It's a structural thing about how the cement industry is organized, and you all know cement companies in Kenya are very heavily protected with tariffs, and therefore Kenyan cement in East Africa is one of the highest. So I'll give you an example. The most expensive cement in the world is bought in Norway, because Norway has very high tariffs and also charges electricity at very high rates. So a product like that, it's most expensive. It comes to almost 40 US cents per kilo, which is about 50 shillings per kilo of cement. Now, if you scale that up, it means that that one bag of cement as sold in Kenya in 50 units will be 2,500. Kenya, cement of similar quality, the highest quality, is closer to about 1,500, right? 1,200 or thereabouts. So Norwegians have 26 times or 30 times higher income than us. They're buying cement at twice the price we are buying. So in terms of affordability, definitely for a Kenyan, our income, it's overwhelming. Now, you might not even think about it like that, but that's what it is. So that's basically the problem. The cheapest cement in the world is actually from Nigeria, which is 6 shillings per kilo. 6 shillings per kilo of cement, which means the cement that in Kenya we buy, I know there's some cement in Kenya for 750 or 800, as somebody reminded me when I was preparing for this meeting, but it's not a top quality cement that you can use for construction. If you buy it in Nigeria, it's 6 shillings per kilo, which means that a whole bag of cement in Nigeria that we Kenyans buy at 1,250 would come, or 1,100 in Nigeria, in its equivalent today, would be 400 shillings. So those things matter for what we see in terms of the quality of housing. It matters. So that's basically a significant thing. And then when it comes to steel, we decided we wanted domestic industry. We've protected some steel companies because we do not want competition from Chinese steel. The effect of that is Kenyans have less steel for the inputs, be it nails, be it bolt, be it steel, which helps with steel doors, which helps with the structure, which would improve roofing material and improve that. So all those things, and our fiscal policy and taxation structure, and our trade policy questions have an effect on the affordability of houses. And so when you're talking about affordable housing is a good policy, but it does not mean you construct new housing by government. It simply means you enable people, most of whom are constructing their own. There's a strong housing market in Kenya. It should be a job and employment provider if the number of houses, or if the inputs into the housing stock were more competitively priced. So you're right. The policy implication was it's more competition. And we have to ask ourselves whether protecting 5, 6 cement companies and one steel company is worth the price that we are paying in terms of the quality of housing, the deficits that we see, and at the same time, once in a while, the collapses that occur to very bad effect on Kenyan lives. So you're right, Kenny. Mushai, let me answer. You didn't ask me directly, but I'll answer. Yes. Just like you, I've really looked for where this number 200,000 came from. And the one that I could most remember was a World Bank report, which was published in 2014 or 2015, it could be later, which stated that urban units, there's that deficit. How it was calculated, it was in that range. Sometimes they say 200, sometimes they say 300,000 per year. And it's remained at 200,000 per year for like 20 years. So suggesting that, for like 10 years, suggesting that there's a big backlog. I am not totally persuaded. I think that number was pulled off the air, or the back of envelope calculation was made, which needs to be more carefully interrogated. And it's important for us, just like you see it as well, which is to then ask, what is the qualitative cost of constructing another 200,000 units at 160 billion per year based on this? That is discounting the price of land, when you could say, what do we do? Do you want to subsidize? This is not our proposal. Do you want to subsidize construction material, or do you want to enable more competition in construction material? And by that, of course, you also create the jobs and all that. The job numbers that are being stated right now as having been created by affordable housing, in my view, are not something that I would cite in a meeting of sane people, because it's basically translating from one side to the other, and claiming that you created new jobs. The numbers by the National Bureau of Statistics itself does not show that the construction industry has actually had more jobs. So I'm very, very cagey about constructing them. And I think that's the problem about being caught in a narrative that this is working. We start to generate all number of numbers to do that. So you're right. Again, that 200K target needs to be considered very, very carefully. And if it's a 200K target, it might not be a 200K target for 9 million shillings houses. It might be a 200K target for a house in the $500,000 to $1 million range. So, but you're right, but I think it's obviously overstated, because if you look at the data that we showed, and especially incomes, one of the things that's known is an inverse relationship between incomes and household size. Kenya is already well above. Kenya is at Brazil's level. We are closer to Brazil than to India and Nigeria. So we tend to have even smaller homes than the other places, because of urbanization, perhaps the kind of urbanization that's taking place in Kenya, but also out there. So already the demand is really, really strong. It would probably be stronger if the prices of inputs were higher, were lower or more competitive. But as it exists today, you cannot say that Kenya lacks housing stock. What we lack is the improvement on existing houses. So a policy that talks for the abandonment of that, in my view, is a bit questionable. So for Wafula, yes, what is the housing demand and housing supply? And we see that in Nairobi. Recently I've become more persuaded about something that I call shoe leather economics, which is basically to take your shoes, walk around the city in Nairobi, and ask yourself why things are happening the way they are, and why government or people in government see them differently, and why your colleagues even and other people see it differently, and try to answer for yourself. And if you walk around the Kilimani area, you walk about even the Lamington area and all this place, fantastic, world-class level of apartments are out here. Fantastic ones. And you can go in them. Well, these days it's because they know everybody goes in to take pictures, and then you try and replicate it in another part of the country. Some of them charge you to actually visit, but that's okay. It's an interesting conversation, an interesting revelation. And it's showing you that a housing shortage is not here. The demand is the structural problem. And so the problem we need to concentrate on: how do we raise employment, and how do we raise people's incomes, and how do we raise their productivity? World-class construction of apartments and even maisonettes in Nairobian townhouses is available. Some of them are not occupied. So it's not a problem about housing stock per se. It's a question of that. So housing demand and housing supply, and real demand, effective demand, I'd like to live in a penthouse, but I don't, because my income predicate that I should live in a certain flat, because it's what, in the end, it's actually service from existing cash. So that's, from existing employment. So we should concentrate on the quality of employment and all, and that. And the belief that simply constructing houses is going to be in itself turbocharge employment or a different kind of industrial manufacturing is something I'm not too persuaded about yet. Thanks.
Thanks, Kwame. Mo, do you have any comments or any response to any of the questions?
I'd like to respond to Emmanuel's question on the housing argument being indefensible for an economist. Just from the data that we've seen on the availability of housing units, as well as just basically from the demand side and also from the supply side. And I think Kwame has already mentioned some houses being vacant, and for the government to intervene in the housing market, there has to be a problem in the housing market. And that the problem exists for the government to intervene by building maybe affordable houses. What should the government be doing instead to make sure maybe the structures are of good quality, among other things, instead of trying to build houses for people? And also on this chart that shows, okay, it's not loading. Yes, on this chart that shows plans made by tenants towards home ownership. Yeah, the data just speaks for itself, and people having a preference and leaning towards a different side. So yes, as an economist using data and also economic principles, uh, the affordable housing arguments doesn't hold. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you, Mo. So we'll have a final round of questions. If I could have Stephen. Stephen, you could unmute yourself and ask your question. And then I think Mushai had also raised his hand. So Stephen, and then we'll have a go with Mushai. Stephen, unmute yourself.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. It's always a pleasure to hear from Maureen and Kwame. And very excited about this particular presentation. I have one single question, which I directed to Kwame. How can Kenya's macroeconomic policies address housing supply shortages for those without plans to own a mortgage in Kenya? Because from the data, I see that 62% of people are not willing, they have no plans. So I direct to Kwame. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mushai?
Thank you, Maureen. Yeah, and I actually managed to put my comment on the chat. I think something Kwame said, I think the figure actually came from Vision 2030 a while ago on that 200,000. But the context of it was that for us to become a middle income country, we need to build that many houses. So I suppose in a middle income country, people need to be living in a house of a certain kind. But since we didn't manage to achieve the rest on the other parameters of Vision 2030, or we are quite far lagging on that. That's why maybe there is still a lag, and that's why maybe that comparison with our average incomes is what tells us what happened there. But I think 2030 was the source of that number. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Mushai. Mike?
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Winnie, for such an amazing session. My name is Mike Sisi. So I'll go direct to my question. I'd love to know what role does housing play in breaking the cycle of poverty? Because you may find some may own homes and they're still poor.
All right, thank you, Mike. And then Eric Musau, maybe the affordable housing project is really about replacing slums, which might still suggest a case for the initiative, housing levy and other concerns aside. I think that's a comment, and the presenters could also have a view on it. So I'll go back to our presenters. I'll now start with Mo. And Mo, as you conclude, as you give your responses, you could also just share with us your closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Winnie. I'll respond to Mike's question on the role of housing in breaking poverty, where he says some people have houses, but they're still poor. Yes, just going back to the data on the on the ownership, like 61.3% of households in Kenya are okay, it's more or less like a preference, but it also indicates income. Income is the one that dictates your tenureship status, because your income is the one that determines whether you'll be renting, you'll be renting or leasing, you'll be owning, or maybe squatting somewhere, being a squatter somewhere. So okay, yeah, housing is a basic need. Yes, having shelter is a basic need. So I think by being a basic need, by being able to be sheltered somewhere. Okay, I don't know how it breaks poverty. Its role in breaking poverty. And yeah, Eric Musawi says maybe affordable housing projects is really about replacing slums, which may still suggest a case for the initiative. And if we look at the slum structures, most of them are situated in urban areas. I think in the urban setup, whereby people who live in these slums they live there because of an economic activity that they might be conducting maybe in the neighborhood or something. And by staying there, perhaps they have a second home in their rural area. So I don't know whether taxing these people to build houses in urban areas is really solving the housing problem in Kenya. Yeah, and yeah, I'll share the link to the reports. Yeah, you can find more from the data. You can find more insights on it. Yeah, please go read the data, and thank you for attending the webinar.
Thank you. Kwame?
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. And thanks, yes, Mushai, for giving us a link to the Vision 2030 and where the first report, the first claim that we need 200,000 houses would come from. Okay. So let's go to Stephen. How can macroeconomic policy address those without plans to buy? So I have a problem with that question for two reasons. Why? If somebody doesn't have a plan to buy, we should ask themselves why. It may be that part of that figure are those who already own other homes. That's one. Or that's not their preference. Remember, housing or shelter is a function also where you are in the life cycle. So as you've seen, our dependency rates determine how many children and what the demand for housing might be. So that's one. And if somebody doesn't want to buy, I think that part of the no plan is predicated majorly by an economic factor, which is basically, if I don't have yet money, why should I plan to buy? That's one. Two, some people prefer to rent. Part of the affordable housing problem that I also had was the narrative conditioned us to somehow think that a person who rents a house is a lower quality human being. How can you rent? Because we see the wrong economic advice that comes from talk shows and well, nothing wrong with talk shows. Some of them are good, but more importantly, with the raffles in Kenya. And those competitions that tell you that now I'm owning a house, I'm a higher quality human being. You're not. But well, you're entitled to think you are. So it's that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong in rental. As you can see, in rural areas, people prefer to own their own homes because they own the land and they have probably a permanent structure there. In urban areas, they say, look, I probably have a job for the next 5 years. My circumstances might change, which means I might elevate or go to a different to a different job, maybe even travel out of the country or travel out of this station. So it serves a specific purposes. So provided people have shelter and they're using the adequacy of that shelter or the fitness of that shelter and the room fitness, and those are the things that we should care for. Preferences vary globally. There's no reason why we should think. But of course, if somebody's selling a mortgage, they want you to be the one who buys, because out of that they get a. So part of that was the bias in Kenya that home ownership is a superior form of shelter provision, and I'm not too sure necessarily that is, especially if you look at the fact that most bungalows owned out there. If you look at the rural areas, which is 85% bungalows, and they're the lowest quality housing, so maybe owning is not necessarily bad, but it by itself will not determine the quality of your shelter. Something else does, and in our view, that something is income and jobs. So I don't know that macroeconomic policy should aim to make everybody a homeowner. People might have it, but perhaps some people have other priorities, and we should let them choose. And so the way to think about it is to think about how do we make sure that the ingredients that create a good house, and we saw from that picture, from that radar map, that the problem is the structural fitness of the houses, and the second one is the question of the structural fitness on the one side and the integrity of the walls on the other. So if you provide that for people, then that's it. So this is the picture that I would like to read from, and this is a picture that tells you, regardless of who owns what, we have a problem with the structural integrity of the houses in our country. So Stephen, that's what I prefer. I wouldn't think that somebody who's managing macroeconomic policies should specifically think that we should drive people towards ownership. And that's why I say it would be good if the 1 million people want to have mortgages. It's not going to happen at 9 million, certainly not. per house, it's probably going to come down. And if people choose that, that's okay. It gives you easy terms upon which to pay over a longer period of time. But if you look at the job structure in Kenya, most of us work in informal areas, and informal areas don't give you the structure where you have a 20-year plan to purchase and to send a specific amount of income every day because of the fluctuation. So new products might have to be developed for that kind of employment structure, but in the end, it's predetermined by economic conditions. Musau, replacing slums. I've had that as well, because affordable housing first was to improve housing, and then it came about urban areas, and now it's about replacing slums. Okay, if you think about 200,000 housing units constructed per year, at a minimum rate of 160 billion shillings net of the cost of the land, how fast will that shrink the slums in Kenya? I'm not too sure that it will, to be honest. I'm not even sure that it will, to begin with. That's one. Two, I have a problem with that because, as this picture shows us, the real problem is housing, if that's what we are trying to solve, and not necessarily a bias with a certain look of apartments in fancy places. Then the housing problem should be solved is helping people who live in Kenya's rural areas to live in far better structures. So the structural fitness on one side and the fitness, habitability of those rooms, it's overwhelmingly a rural problem. So that's it. So that's one. If I had 160 billion shillings by government to spend, what is the biggest public service that is consumed in Kenya? It's education. Primary schools in Kenya are in an atrocious rate. So if you're still obsessed with construction, the brick and mortar people that Kenya Kwanza are, then maybe they should be considering about the construction of schools. For 160 billion, you get fantastic schools throughout the republic. Building classrooms, so you're still consuming the cement, because some of them might have connections to these enterprises, or prefer industrial policy in that way, you still construct. But on the housing unit where there are 13 million of them, constructing an additional 200,000 shillings would give a lift to the 200,000 people who are subsidized, but you're also creating distortions in the housing market, especially in urban areas, in those places where you do, because you just have people flipping to better houses, and of course, you relegate the low-income people to even the lower ones. So I'm not too sure that that solves the problem. A school building program for which government raises funds, that I would. But right now, as a person who pays for the affordable housing thing, I'm thinking we are whistling in the wind. But a school replacement program, that would be fantastic, and I think it would have measurable impact in Kenya. Why? Because more than housing, the demand for schools based on our income, the population structure, will actually rise even faster in the coming years. Kids will be coming into primary school in millions for the rest of the generation. Mike, role of housing in breaking the cycle of poverty. I think the causality goes not from housing to poverty. It's people who have broken the cycle of poverty by having better jobs, by having better productivity, getting better houses. So housing is good quality housing is the result of having a better quality job. And if you take nothing else from our conversation today, please make sure that's one of the things to remember, that you cannot give people housing and raise their standards of living if they don't have jobs. It's actually when people have better jobs, they can even get houses that they'll be qualified to keep, and they'll be willing to keep, and perhaps even improve over time. So, ladies and gentlemen, we provide all the links to this, but we thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, so thank you so much, Kwame and Maureen. I think Kwame and Maureen deserve a round of applause. So you can use your clapping emoji just to show appreciation to the two of them for the presentation and for the insights I believe you have all gained as you were having this conversation. So as usual, please be on the lookout on our website for future webinars. This is the first of many that we have planned out for you this 2025. So we would appreciate you still being on the lookout and joining us for consequent conversations and just being part of elevating the different dialogues that we will be having. I'm sure you have noticed that there's been a bit of change in how we are doing our registrations. We are now sending you a link that has a registration form, and we humbly request that you take a minute or two during registration just to log in and put in your details, majorly because moving forward, we want to track everybody who joins in our conversations and also just be able to see what areas what areas attract who. So we're just building a webinar database. So you will be of help by just joining using that link to register for our webinars. Also, IEA is still a membership organization. So please, if you haven't joined us as a member, feel free to to reach out to our communications team. Oscar will be here to support you and ensure that you get into our list of registered members, and the perks, I'm sure, once you discuss with Oscar, will be things that will be exciting to you. So that said, thank you so much for making time to join this conversation. We believe it has been insightful, and the coming ones will also be just as insightful as this is. And always leave comments on areas you think we can improve ourselves, and on areas you think we can improve our conversations, and areas you think we need to be holding more conversations around. That said, do have a lovely afternoon and enjoy the rest of your day.